The leaves are beginning to change color and fall, and that can only mean one thing: it's leaf season. But what happens when your backpack blower won't start? Now, the cost to replace this particular backpack blower would be extremely expensive, so much so that it's almost worth having a shop fix it. But if you have a few hours, it might be worth a shot to try it yourself. I mean, what are you going to do? Make it worse, or maybe accidentally fix it? All I'm saying is take a close look at it, and maybe it's something you can fix. In today's video, we look at this Shindaiwa backpack blower, and the problem is that it won't start. Now, I wish I could say that I found this one for free using one of the free websites I like to visit, but unfortunately, this one belongs to a coworker. That means I'll have to give it back to them when I'm done with it, but I do intend on testing it a lot before then. Now, I'm going to try and repair this blower, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. If things aren't working out for you like they are in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. The first thing that I want to do is to take a good look at it and see if there's anything obviously wrong with it. I'm looking for anything that might be broken or missing, and aside from the control stalk looking a little bit suspicious, the blower is intact. The only thing that I don't like is that the carb area is covered in the worst looking dirt and grease I've ever seen. Now, this will be important later on, but right now it doesn't point to anything serious. It did come with fuel in the tank, and that could be the reason for it not to start, but right now I want to try and start it and see what it does or doesn't do. So it didn't start, which is what I was expecting it to do. The next thing that I want to do is to get to the inlet on the carb so I can put some fuel into it to see if it's a fuel issue. That's when I realized the intake was loose. In fact, it's much too loose. This would cause an intake leak, which would mean the engine is very unlikely to start. However, I'm still going to try to put fuel into it for another test start. Now, either the intake has a massive air leak causing it not to draw in fuel, or we might be missing spark. Now, to test for spark, I'm going to use a spark checker that I can install in line with the plug. If you need one of these, there should be a link in the description. Now, after installing the tester, pull on the rope and watch for an orange glow in the tester. So there was an orange glow in the tester, which means the ignition system is working and we definitely have spark. The next thing that I want to do is to get to the intake on the engine and see why it's loose. But before I do that, I want to try and clean up the dirt and grease that's covering this blower, at least everywhere I need to be. Now, does this help with the diagnostic? Nope, not really, but I'll be able to see any new leaks when I get the blower running again, and to be honest, it's just a nice thing to do for a coworker anyway. For those of you who are curious, I'm using a degreaser from Harbor Freight, and I didn't think I was going to need to use it, but this grease and dirt was being very stubborn, and the reason will make a little bit more sense here in a bit. Now, after spraying the majority of the blower, I'm going to remove the rear cover to make filming a bit easier. You don't need to do this, but for me, it makes sense. This will also give me a chance to inspect the engine, especially the bolts that hold the engine together. Now, I wasn't planning on doing a compression test, but since I have the spark plug out anyway, I might as well test it. Now, I don't replace spark plugs unless I have a starting issue, so this one is going to go back in. I also want to check the spark arrestor screen because if it's clogged, it could cause some problems, but as you can see, there's no screen in the outlet. If there was a screen in there, I wouldn't be able to touch the back of the muffler with my screwdriver. So the reading, as expected, is very high at over 155 psi, and that's the reason why it's a bit tough to pull the rope. As of right now, we have 2 of the 3 major components for this engine to start and run, so we just need to get fuel to the engine, and after taking a closer look at it, I think I can see why the fuel is missing from the engine. Just as expected, the intake was loose, and it seems the insulator isn't even sitting against the engine, which means the air getting inside the engine isn't going through the carb, which means no fuel is going to make it in either. So we need to get to the bolts that hold the insulator to the engine and figure out what happened to them. They may have just backed out, or they might be damaged, which means even more work for us. So here's the insulator, and if we take a closer look at it, it's very obvious the bolts have come loose. Next, we'll take them out and see if there's any damage to them or the cylinder, and if so, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. But after getting them out along with the insulator, I don't see any metal on the threads, which means more than likely the threads will be okay. While we have the intake off, I want to take a look at the piston and rings just so we can get a visual on how they're supposed to look when an engine is this healthy. And as you can see, there's not much wear on the piston and rings at all, which is to be expected with these compression numbers. Now, if yours has any scoring on it, it means the engine does have some wear to it. Now, we didn't get away from any serious damage. If you take a closer look at the gasket for the insulator to the engine, it seems to have been damaged, and this sort of damage can only happen over time. That means this leak has been here for a very long time, and it's only gotten larger over time. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to replace it, otherwise the engine is not going to start. The problem is that it costs quite a lot of money for something made out of cardboard, and it's also going to take a week to get here, but I'm not that patient, so I'm going to go with a different plan. Now, I've never heard this engine start and run before, so I'm going to take a quick look at the carb just to make sure it's okay, and also replace the purge bulb because it's already broken. Now, there are typically two different sizes of bulbs, and this one is the smaller one. So here's the metering diaphragm, and as you can see, it's still very flexible. Now, there are some wrinkles in it, but if you take a look at it from the side, it hasn't caused it to warp just yet, so we're going to keep this one on here. Besides that, I don't normally carry this type of diaphragm, and it would take a few days for a new one to show up. Now, once the carb is back together, we now have to deal with that broken gasket. Now for the gasket, I'm going to try to make a new one to replace the broken one. So you can either trace the old one out onto some gasket paper, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is to make an imprint of it. The problem isn't making the imprint, it's trying to punch out the openings. Now I kind of messed up on the first one, so I had a second go at it, and even though it's not perfect, it's going to work much better than the original one. Of course, I don't want this to happen again in the future, so I'm going to use some medium strength thread locker to keep the bolts from coming loose. Now, I did check the bolts that hold the jug to the engine, and luckily they were still tight. I also didn't see any old thread locker on the bolts that backed out, so that's a very good reason why they were able to back out. Now, this blower is several seasons old, and it is used commercially, so it's lasted quite a long time. Also, when I got this blower, the purge bulb was already broken, so when we get the fuel lines connected to the carb, I need to make sure it's able to pull fuel from the tank, because if it doesn't, the engine is not likely to start. After pressing the bulb a few times, luckily the bulb is filling with fuel, which is a good thing. If yours is not filling with fuel, then you might have an issue with the carb or the fuel lines. If you have an issue, I would consider replacing the carb and inspecting the fuel lines. Also, if you have an issue with your air filter, please do not run your blower without it. Now, luckily this filter is in great shape, so I can only guess it was replaced recently. Also, one more tip before we try and start this blower, make sure you let it warm up for at least a minute before you use it. I know a minute of warm up sounds terrible, but I would start the blower and then find something to do for a minute and then come back to use it. The most wear the engine can experience, besides being ran without oil and the gasoline, is for it to be used while the engine is still cold. I would also do the same for any 2-cycle engine like a trimmer and an edger. Also, make sure the proper amount of oil is mixed with the gasoline. If you don't think you can do that, I would use canned fuel from the hardware store instead. So it turns out this blower is an absolute monster when it comes to blowing leaves. I almost forgot how awesome a good backpack blower can be to use, especially when it comes to heavier items like pecans and small twigs. So in the end, some thread locker from the factory would have kept this from happening, but then again, aside from making a new gasket, the fix was pretty simple. Now if you're not sure what you're doing or what you're looking for, have someone with you to look at it as well, because two heads are better than one. I know not everyone needs something this powerful, but if you have trees on your property or there's some next door, then you'll understand the issues with the amount of leaves that can come from them, and having something like this can be very helpful in keeping your property looking decent in the winter months. So my question is, would you ever consider buying a backpack blower no matter what size it is? Now I used to say no and I would just abuse my small handheld blower, but as the years go by I find my shoulder getting sore after each use, so I might have to consider buying one of these. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.